Merci. Thank you.
Thank you.
Merci, merci chacun
Thank you,
et
thank
chacune.
you,
Merci, Monsieur le
everybody.
Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Avec autant de talent,
You have so much talent, and this caucus is extraordinary. Dear liberal friends, the next 2 weeks will be crucial. When we are back in our counties, we'll have a lot to say to Canadians. I count on you to explain to Canadians why the conservative budget is bad for our country.
Laissez-moi aujourd'hui
Let me summarize the reasons why this budget does not correspond to the Canadians' priorities, and it spends way too much.
Stephen Harper gave Canada clarity. And let's talk about the result. Never before has a Canadian government done so little with so much. This budget is unfair. This budget is short-sighted. This budget is dishonest, and this budget is divisive. Start with this budget is unfair. Indeed, it does nothing for students. It does nothing for the poor. It does nothing for Aboriginals. It does nothing for single working mothers trying to make ends meet. Only people who make more than $35,000 per year can benefit from the conservative child benefit. Canadians' poorest families get nothing from this budget. Instead, this budget increases the gap between the haves and the have-nots. To quote the Calendar Institute, the worst part of this budget is what it lacks. Aucune mesure pour réduire la pauvreté des
to
enfants.
reduce children's poverty. Nothing for preschool education. No national program for children. Nothing for urgent needs in infrastructure. No engagement to end the problems that Indigenous people live, and nothing for lodgings.
The government has the responsibility to ask, where do we want Canada to be in 10 years? And how do we get there? In 10 years, it's very clear what we want, we liberals. I want, and we want, a richer Canada, a fairer Canada, and a greener Canada. To get there, we need to invest in research, we need to invest in education, and we need broad-based tax cuts. This budget does none of that. Maybe Mr. Harper thinks that the world owes Canada a living. The world economy is becoming tougher and more competitive. The environmental challenges are becoming larger. I want Canada to be on the podium of the sustainable economy. I want to take Canada in the right direction. Nancy Hughes Anthony, the president of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, said about the budget, this government promised to make Canada more competitive, and I think they broke that promise today. But the Conservatives broke more than one promise on budget day. Yes, this budget is dishonest. The Conservatives said they would hold the line on spending. Instead, Jim Flaherty is now the biggest spending finance minister in Canadian history. He has increased spending by $25 billion over 2 years, an increase that the Vancouver Board of Trade calls unsustainable. The Conservatives said they would help middle-class Canadians. Instead, they raised income taxes, taking an extra $1.4 billion out of Canadians' paychecks. The Conservatives promised not to tax income trust. Mr. Harper made that promise himself. Then he went back on his word, and 1 million Canadians paid the price. the Liberal income trust plan would soften the blow and put back some of the money that was ripped out of Canadian savings. Ce budget divise les Canadiens.
This budget divides Canadians. Jim Flaherty said that the fiscal imbalance between provinces are over. How could it be over with all these broken promises? Mr. Flaherty and Mr. Harper wrapped themselves in their promise to reduce that fiscal imbalance, but they did not put any numbers to it. They say now the question is over, but that's not what prime ministers of provinces say.
Premier Lone Calvert called this budget a betrayal. The premiers of New Brunswick and British Columbia said the same. The Premier of Nova Scotia is taking the federal government to court. So much for the end of bickering. So, an unfair budget, a short-sighted budget, a dishonest budget, and a divisive budget. Never has a government done so little with so much. Canadians of every province deserve better than this government. Quant aux électeurs du Québec,
Quebec electors need and deserve a lot more than that. Never did a Canadian First Minister try to manipulate the Quebec election. The federal power of spending, Mr. Harper said that his policy depended on the way that Quebec electors would vote, and everybody denounced this in Quebec. This is blackmail. This did not help Mr. Jean Charest.
The Prime Minister must now explain to all Canadians how and why he wants to further limit the role of the federal government. He must explain which powers, which responsibilities he wants to take away from the federal government. And he must justify it in terms of the public interest, not in terms of blackmail and electoral manipulations.